It's now my pleasure to introduce Kenneth Mack. Professor Mack began his career in engineering as an electrical and computer engineer for Bell Laboratories, but he soon left that position to pursue a career in law and academia, receiving a JD from Harvard Law School and a master's and PhD in history from Princeton. He's been teaching here at Harvard Law School since 2000, with courses ranging from property law, American legal history, civil rights history, and the legal construction of racial identity. And his scholarship on race relations and the law has been widely published. His new book, Representing the Race, The Creation of the Civil Rights Lawyer, is a sort of collective biography exploring the lives and careers of African-American lawyers working in the years leading up to and including the civil rights movement. Their careers in the ensuing field of civil rights law ultimately raise the question, what does it mean to represent a minority? We're very pleased that he can join us this afternoon, so please join me in welcoming Kenneth Mack.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Rachel and the Harvard Bookstore for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in 2012 at the Harvard Bookstore to talk about a topic that we think we know a lot about, but we don't. And what I'd like to do in a little bit of time today is tell you why that's so and why this is a story that everybody should be interested in, but most of us don't really know. My book it's a biographical account of the men and women who created something that we all take for granted. The men and women who helped change America from a nation that countenanced explicit race discrimination enacted in law to an America that, that believes in equality as one of its core values. And my book is about the men and the women who helped create this, specifically about the lawyers. It's a collective biography, as Rachel told you, of a number of African-American civil rights lawyers who practiced in the era of segregation, who were affiliated with the NAACP, but who, as we'll find out today, have a very complicated history of racial politics. This is a story, as I said, that we think we know, but we don't. We read about this in school all the time. We read about Brown versus Board of Education, the NAACP's litigation campaign that led to the decision. We read biographies of black lawyers, civil rights lawyers like Thurgood Marshall. In fact, there's a new biography of him just out called Devil in the Grove by the writer Gilbert King, which is a very conventional but beautifully written story of Marshall as a heroic figure. But in reality, we know very little about the men and women who did this. And I spent about a decade of my life trying to excavate their worlds and to come up with a deeply contextualized reading of the world of segregation and the world of the men and women who helped end it. I'm trying to change the way Americans and hopefully people outside of America think about famous people like Thurgood Marshall and introduce little known but incredibly important cast of characters to the narrative of American history. My book, Representing the Race, it's a revisionist civil rights history in a lot of ways. There are no heroes and villains in the book, right? It's not a book that chronicles the heroic struggles of people like Thurgood Marshall for racial equality, although anyone who reads my book would term those struggles heroic. But it's not my purpose to recover heroism. It's to do something that I think hasn't been done, which is to read civil rights history through our own politics or through our own time. What questions will we ask of the past in 2012? At present, we have a very confused racial politics. Racial identity seems more malleable than ever, more complicated, and often reading civil rights history, reading biographies of people like Thurgood Marshall, gives us a comforting narrative, a time where good and evil were arrayed more starkly, that when we knew what to do if we wanted to work for equality. And I'm trying to tell a very complicated story, a story in which the past is actually not that much different than the present. So to give you a little bit of context, I'll talk about a few of the lawyers in the book, and then I'll do a little bit of reading, and then we'll have a question and answer. So a few of the lawyers in the book. As I said, one of them, of course, is Thurgood Marshall. As many of you know, born in Baltimore in 1908, becomes the head of the NAACP's legal team. It's the principal lawyer who brings Brown versus Board of Education, later becomes the first black Supreme Court justice, and in many ways a heroic figure, as many of you know. I retell the story of Thurgood Marshall, in particular his first 3 years as a lawyer. What did he do? He's from Baltimore. He goes back to Baltimore and is there for 3 years before he goes to New York to work for the NAACP. And what I found out is the thing that shaped Thurgood Marshall more than anything else as a lawyer and shaped him for the rest of his career was that he was an African American who was unlike other black people. He seemed different. He was the black person in Maryland who could speak to whites. He was a black person in Maryland for whom white moderates saw, something of themselves. They thought he represented them. But local black communities thought he represented them too. He was the black person who would go into a county where they had never seen a black lawyer before. As a matter of fact, they'd never seen a black professional before, except for maybe a teacher or two, and have to talk to white judges and white lawyers and white jurors who had never seen a black person before, who had never actually talked to someone like him before as an equal. He was an odd duck when he walked into a courtroom in rural Maryland, and that was the source of his power. He was unlike other black people. Other people in the book, there's a lawyer named Loren Miller, a Los Angeles lawyer, very well known in his time, largely forgotten today. He was a leading civil rights lawyer in Los Angeles from the late 1930s to the early 1960s. He represented the black Muslims famously in the early 1960s when there was a police raid on the Muslim temple in Los Angeles. Malcolm X comes there, and it's the incident that begins to split Malcolm X off from Elijah Muhammad. Very, very well-known person in his own time. Well, Loren Miller was also a biracial lawyer. He was the son of a black father and a European mother, grew up near an Indian reservation in Kansas, learned that he was black in college because he got discriminated against, decided that he was a Marxist, went to the Soviet Union with Langston Hughes, came back, decided that somebody like Thurgood Marshall was the fount of all that was bad in American racial politics rather than someone who was good, wrote a lot of articles saying this, became really well known all over the country for representing this position, and in about 6 months, he shifts entirely. And 10 years after he's writing these things about Thurgood Marshall, saying Thurgood Marshall is really just the wrong way to go in civil rights politics, he and Thurgood Marshall proudly appear alongside one another in the United States Supreme Court to argue the racially restrictive covenant cases, which convinced the U.S. Supreme Court to strike down restrictive covenants and open up private housing markets to African Americans all around the country, right? So people with very, very complicated racial histories are in this book. Another person who's in this book is a woman named Pauli Murray, who maybe a few of you may recognize her name. She's a black woman lawyer, graduated from Howard Law School in 1944, and invented an idea that in 1944 she called Jane Crow. Jane Crow was basically like Jim Crow. Pauli Murray's idea was that there are all these ways in which American society discriminates against women, and they should be legally actionable for the same reasons that race discrimination is legally actionable. That was a fringe position in 1944, but over the next 20 years, she begins to convince more and more people that she's right. And one of the people she convinces that she's right is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who now is a U.S. Supreme Court justice, but early in her career was a women's rights lawyer. And when Ruth Bader Ginsburg files the first brief that convinces the U.S. Supreme Court to apply the Equal Protection Clause to sex discrimination, Ginsburg signs Pauli Murray's name to the brief as the person who originated the ideas that finally convinced the Supreme Court to rule this way. Well, in the book, I figure out, well, why did Pauli Murray come up with this idea of Jane Crow when basically nobody thought that way in 1944? And even in 1964, very, very controversial way to think about sex discrimination. She came up with the idea because Pauli Murray had a deeply complicated and contested identity. She was a light-skinned black woman who was always kind of on the wrong side of the color line. Sometimes she was too light, sometimes she was too dark. She had members of her family who could pass for white, but she couldn't. But the other thing that was very interesting about Pauli Murray is that Pauli Murray in her own time would be labeled a transgendered person. Pauli Murray believed that she was a man in a woman's body and went through life thinking like that. She wants to be a civil rights lawyer, and she's among all these very forward-looking, racially progressive black lawyers at Howard Law School. She's involved with the NAACP, but these progressive lawyers don't want her to be a civil rights lawyer or have some problem with her being a civil rights lawyer because, of course, being a civil rights lawyer is men's work. And unlike other black women lawyers, Pauli Murray begins to think of this problem, her problem of just not being welcome in the courtroom, as a problem of sex discrimination, and begins to think about how to do something about it. And the reason she did this was because of her own deeply contested and hidden and complicated and painful identity struggle that lasted her entire life. Okay, so these are the kinds of stories that are in the book. So complicated stories, stories that I hope change an important strain of American history and tell a story about an ambivalence about the nature of an integrated society, the complicated struggles around identity that were engaged in by men and women who practiced law in an era in which racial identity should have been easy. It was the era of segregation. Everybody knows who's black and who's white, and what black people and what white people are supposed to do, and what men and what women are supposed to do. But as these lawyers went about their lives, they found that question more and more complicated. So let me read for just a little bit, because I can tell you all these things about the book, but the devil is really in the details. So I'll read just a few passages just to give you a texture of some of the things that are in the book, and then we can take questions and answers. So let me start at, almost at the beginning of the book with an African-American lawyer named Raymond Pace Alexander, who is the leading civil rights lawyer in Philadelphia for about 30 years. So we start here in 1925. For those of you who might be reading along, I'm starting on page 12. In 1925, a young black lawyer named Raymond Pace Alexander stepped gingerly but forcefully across the color line in his hometown of Philadelphia when he rose to give a speech before a local white civic group. Only 2 years had elapsed since his graduation from Harvard Law School, but he was already racking up a string of improbable courtroom victories that would soon make him one of the best-known lawyers in the city, regardless of race. That year, he also won his first major civil rights case when he broke the color bar at a Center City movie house. He had much to explain to his white listeners, and he started in fast. Alexander asked his audience to empathize with the plight of the, quote, American Negro of education and high social standing in his group, who was having more and more difficulty finding, quote, a place to live in keeping with his means and standing. What hope is there for harmonious race relations, he asked, when there is no opportunity for your people to know my people of responsibility, means, and position? Very few whites, argued Alexander, come into regular contact with a, quote, Negro of high training and education, the man of letters, the successful man in business, the artist, the professional man. The tragic result of irrational white prejudice, Alexander argued, was that racial issues were driven by the influence of, quote, our most unrepresentative persons. 3 months later, Alexander went before a black audience and delivered a message that was entirely consistent with what he had said on the other side of the color line. Speaking before the middle-class congregation of Union AME Church in North Philadelphia, he urged his listeners to get behind an effort to stamp out segregation that was still openly practiced in the city's elementary schools. He offered the usual reasons. Segregated education was unconstitutional, it psychologically harmed black children, it resulted in unequal school facilities, but he went further. American society, he argued, quote, has its standard of supremacy of the white man, his acts and achievements, his precepts and examples, his law and government. If black Americans want equal rights and fair treatment, quote, we must study and train up to that standard. We must, of necessity, ape the white man and consider him our preceptor, if only for the selfish purpose of granting what he has to teach us. School segregation, he concluded, robbed segregated black children of the contacts with the white social world and cultural standards that provided the benchmarks for measuring their progress on the road to responsible citizenship. Now, these words ring uneasily in our own ears. They sound odd, and they should. Because Alexander's remarks were not the voice of accommodation to white mores in an era of segregation, nor were they the words of a prosperous lawyer with little contact with those for whom he spoke. In fact, Raymond Pace Alexander had only recently arrived in the comfortable middle class after an upbringing that often brought him perilously close to poverty. Alexander's remarks expressed instead a common enough 1920s-era worldview among the men and women who 2 decades later would do much to teach their fellow Americans about the meaning of integration. They called themselves representative Negroes, and they occupied an often uncomfortable space between white desires and black hopes. One can find traces of their story in many eras of American history, including our own. So that's 1925. Let me skip forward just a few years to 1933, and to Baltimore, and to Thurgood Marshall. And I'll read just the beginning of the Thurgood Marshall chapter. Again, a lot of what is interesting about the book are really the details. What's it like for Thurgood Marshall to go into a town that's never seen a black person like him before? What do you do? Do you go to court? Do they call you mister or not? Do they lynch you or not? Do they call you sir in the courtroom? How do they respond? No one quite knew. But let me just read you just the beginning of the Thurgood Marshall chapter. Thurgood Marshall's life as a lawyer is preserved in American history as a story that moves quickly from the beginning of his law practice in Baltimore in 1933 to his first major civil rights case 2 years later that desegregated the University of Maryland's law school, and then to his move to New York to work for the NAACP on the litigation that would lead to Brown. I'm sorry, I'm on page 111 for those of you who are reading along. His life as a young lawyer struggling to build a reputation in Baltimore invokes little interest, save as an example of his neglect of and lack of interest in the ordinary work of an attorney in private practice. Yet Marshall's Baltimore practice files, long available to researchers but little used, paint a picture of a lawyer who was about as successful as other black lawyers in Maryland at getting clients. What I'm saying is a conventional narrative about Thurgood Marshall. He's not really concerned about making any money. He takes all these civil rights cases that don't make him any money, and he's quickly hired by the NAACP, which gives him a comfortable salary and lets him do the work that he really wants to do. And I'm sort of saying, well, there's a lot going on in his early practice, and in fact, not making any money. I mean, no black lawyer in 1933 made any money, and actually, Marshall was pretty typical. What really set Marshall apart, I argue in the book, was his ability to do something that most of his contemporaries could not, get into court in a few high-profile cases that made his reputation on both sides of the color line in Maryland. Marshall came to prominence as a lawyer because, for blacks and whites alike, he seemed to represent something much larger than himself. White lawyers and judges tended to see the young, confident, impeccably trained black lawyer as someone much like themselves. Black Marylanders did too. The authentic representative of African Americans in the courts, both groups told themselves, was a black lawyer who seemed as much like his white colleagues as possible. But each group seemed to want something different from the youthful lawyer whose presence in court seemed so disruptive of local racial mores. White lawyers seemed to desire most of all a person who could explain to a skeptical black public that the legal system treated them fairly. Blacks seemed to want an African-American lawyer whose acceptance by whites gave him the power to call out racial inequality in the system. Marshall walked a fine line in his early years of practice, and the key to his success as a civil rights lawyer was his ability to convince each group that when he stepped into the courtroom, he represented its own particular point of view. It was a paradoxical position, but that balancing act was the foundation for the stunning victories that marked his early years as a lawyer, including the one that desegregated the University of Maryland's law school. Okay, so that's Thurgood Marshall in 1933. Let me skip forward just a little bit. And let me skip forward. Actually, what I want to do is I will skip forward really briefly to let's do, okay. Let's skip forward to 1941, and I'll talk a little bit about Pauli Murray. Okay. We're on page 207. In the fall of 1941, Pauli Murray arrived in Washington, D.C. for a first-year study at Howard Law School, wanting nothing more than to represent her race in its legal battles with segregation. Murray described her civil rights advocacy as motivated by, quote, an almost pathetic loyalty to my racial group, and she was eager to demonstrate it. The incident that set her on the path to law was a simple trip south the previous year to see her relatives, which led to her arrest aboard a segregated bus in Virginia. At the time, Murray was in the midst of a personal crisis caused in part by her inability to fit in, particularly in public places where her racial and gender appearance often seemed ambiguous. When Murray emerged from prison several days later to testify in court, it seemed as though a new world had opened to a woman who had always felt profound discomfort in Southern public space. When prisoners speak, she wrote in her diary, the air is electric with silence. Those feelings grew stronger when she watched the NAACP lawyers come to court for further proceedings in her case. The following year, she began her legal studies at Howard and earned top honors there, placing her in line to join this distinguished group of its leading graduates who often use their training in service of the NAACP. But Murray was at best a representative woman, not a representative man. And so the civil rights courtroom remained off limits to even as an accomplished woman as Sadie Alexander, an accomplished black woman lawyer in Philadelphia. In fact, Murray was a poor choice even as a representative woman of her race. She arrived at Howard with her personal crisis unresolved. Behind the confident facade of the civil rights crusader lay a person in the middle of a crisis of identity. Typically at Howard, she found herself once again out of place, and she would soon coin a phrase to describe what had been bothering her since the mid-1930s. She called it Jane Crow. 2 decades later, she helped Congress name it as sex discrimination, meaning in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And less than a decade after that, Ruth Bader Ginsburg would place Murray's name on a brief that convinced the Supreme Court to elevate what it once seemed like Murray's own personal complaint to the status of constitutional doctrine. Murray's contributions to American law and politics grew out of a crisis of identity that had been building throughout the 1930s. In her world, the two main racial groups were blacks and whites, but as the decades wore on, Murray began to feel representative of neither group. More significantly, in a world where people had to identify themselves as men and women, Murray felt as though she was something else. The civil rights courtroom, she thought, would be a powerful weapon in reclaiming her own personal autonomy and defending the rights of a race that, in her younger years, she claimed to represent. In law school, she would come to question that representativeness and put together a legal theory to back up her new conclusions. Jane Crow was like Jim Crow, she decided. At first, almost no one believed her. But as the years passed, more and more people did. Okay, that's 1941. In the interest of time, let me skip forward, and I think I'm just going to read one more passage. And let me think about what year I should skip forward to. Let me skip forward to 2008. This is page 265. On an unusually warm night in November 2008, an immense, wildly enthusiastic crowd gathered in Chicago's Grant Park to watch the acceptance speech of an African-American former civil rights lawyer who had just been elected President of the United States. Some acknowledgement of history seemed to be required, and the president-elect kept the expected references to civil rights history, like his tone, measured to capture the significance of the moment. Barack Obama had first drawn national media notice in 1990 when he was elected as the first black person to head the prestigious Harvard Law Review, the same institution that helped launch Charles Houston's career 7 decades earlier when Houston became its first black editor. In his election night speech, Obama kept most of his historical references indirect, paraphrasing both Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln before finally invoking the story of an 106-year-old black woman who could not vote early in her life but lived long enough to cast her ballot in the presidential election won by an African American. It is tempting to frame this story solely as an endpoint of a struggle begun by Charles Houston and others for a world where citizenship rights would not be circumscribed by race. That struggle, of course, is an undeniable part of the significance of that November evening, as Obama himself acknowledged to the crowd. The president-elect stood on the shoulders of those Americans who had the courage to stand up or sit down to force their country to acknowledge that humanity had no racial bounds. Since that evening, Americans have argued themselves to a draw over the question of whether the 2008 presidential election was the endpoint of civil rights history or perhaps one more step on a longer journey. Perhaps it is time to turn the page to a different story, particularly in an era in which the civil rights movement lies more than a generation in the past. History, the story of the past, is inevitably written in the present. And our own present circumstances provide an opportunity to tell a story that's become familiar to many Americans, the story of the struggles of blacks and whites during the civil rights era in an unfamiliar way. Protest, repression, struggle, acquiescence, agency, and powerlessness have long been familiar themes in civil rights history. These familiar themes appear in the story told in these pages as they would in any account of the nation's racial history, but they're not the main subjects of the narrative presented here. Instead, the story told here is focused on the divided minds of Americans, black and white, as they have struggled with the question of who exactly could represent a minority group in the give and take of American racial politics. Okay, that's 2008. So I thought I should stop there, and we should take questions, discussion, comments, and I'd love to talk about the book. As I said, the devil really is in the details, and I've only had time to really kind of skim the surface of the really fantastically interesting, and I say this not just from my own perspective as somebody who wrote the book, but I think really fantastically interesting stories of the men and women who worked to uproot segregation at the same time as they found their own racial and sometimes sexual identities to be far more complicated than they initially seemed. So, questions, comments? Well, some of them lived long enough to say what they thought, and so I will talk just about what some of them thought. But just to give you a little bit of context, you're right. Thurgood Marshall was famously quoted in the New York Times sort of after winning Brown saying, I think we're going to smash segregation in about 4 or 5 years. I don't think he's serious when he says that. I mean, Thurgood Marshall, he's a Southerner. He grew up in Maryland. He went out to these rural counties. There's a new book that talks about, the fact that Thurgood Marshall was nearly lynched. And actually several times, but famously in the middle of the 1940s, he goes down to Tennessee, and he comes out, and the police pull him over, and they put him in their car, and they take him down to the river, and they're going to lynch him. And the only thing that saves him is one of his fellow black lawyers drives up, and they see that if they do something to him, they're going to have a bunch of witnesses, so they let him go. Or he goes down to Groveland in 1949, Groveland, Florida, which incidentally is sort of 1 county over from Sanford, where the Trayvon Martin shooting took place, exactly 1 county over. He goes down to Groveland in 1949, where it's just rampant violence. So Marshall knew that this was going to be a struggle. He's kind of tweaking white Southerners when he says right after Brown, we're going to do this in 4 or 5 years. But I do think that he and the other lawyers were very frustrated at the end of their lives, and they thought that the struggle wound up being longer and harder than they would have ever persisted. So Marshall famously in 1987, he was a lot of people said it was inappropriate for him to say this, but on the bicentennial of the Constitution, he said the document was flawed from the beginning. I mean, this was a Constitution that licensed, approved of slavery. And that was one of the compromises that allowed the Constitution to come into being. I mean, he's saying, essentially, we were flawed from the beginning, and we're still living with the consequences of that original sin, which, really, he's saying, will never really be extirpated. Robert Carter, Thurgood Marshall's #2 in Brown versus Board of Education, passed away just last year, and he was very vocal to the end of his life about what he thought about things. And from the 1970s on, he started to talk about something he called white supremacy, which he meant entrenched white opinions that were just deeply held, just would not go away. And I don't know, there's an article in the New York Times sort of yesterday about where they go to Ohio and they interview all these people about Obama. And, that's the kind of stuff that Carter talked about. So many of these lawyers, some of them lived into the 80s and 90s and 2000s. They saw our world, and they were quite vocal about what they thought about it. And what they thought was that maybe they were a little bit too optimistic after Brown, and they were, they acknowledged that a lot had changed. I mean, Marshall and Carter would have been the first to acknowledge that, but they were deeply, they were angry about the racial inequality that persisted and seemed to persist and persist.
Well, what did they get wrong?
I don't think they got anything wrong, right? They're trying to do, everybody struggles within their own particular context. So this is one thing I don't do in this book, right? There's people who argue back and forth about Brown. Was Brown a good thing? Was Brown a bad thing? Were the lawyers naive? Were they not? I'm kind of agnostic on that. It's not the question I'm really trying to ask in this book. I think they were pretty good lawyers. They knew their context, and they were really, really good lawyers in their context. But, segregation and racial inequality turned out to be something really deep and entrenched. And what they did was, was very, very important, but it wasn't the complete answer. Yeah, people like Loren Miller and Pauli Murray, incredibly smart people. Miller, just to fill in the story a little bit, he becomes a leading civil rights lawyer in Los Angeles. As I said, he represents the black Muslims. He actually becomes a local judge near the end of his career. Becomes a judge on the Los Angeles Municipal Court. Now, you ask, the person who's argued and won cases in the United States Supreme Court is a municipal judge? I mean, Thurgood Marshall is a federal judge. Robert Carter is a federal judge. There are a bunch of reasons for that, one of which is that, Loren Miller was a communist in his youth. And that the fact that he was a communist came back to haunt him over and over again throughout his life. He was followed by the FBI. He was red-baited. They would come and harass him in his house. He couldn't get away from this. And he just didn't quite get his due. I mean, he was a mainstream civil rights lawyer, kind of put his communist past behind him, but he couldn't shake it. Pauli Murray is just somebody who's a little bit ahead of her time. I mean, she actually does other things too. I mean, to fill her story in a little bit, she goes into private practice. She works with the ACLU in the 1960s. She's one of the founders of the National Organization for Women. She becomes an Episcopal priest. She was one of the first women ordained as an Episcopal priest in the 1970s. She does all these sort of fantastically interesting things. She was also one of the first black professors at Brandeis University. But she's a little bit ahead of her time. And she can't quite, she wants to do things that black women just simply aren't allowed to do. She's also really unconventional. So even if she was in her time, she was always somebody who just didn't quite fit in. And I think that's part of her issue. Even if you brought her forward in time, she would never fit in. This is kind of key to who she is. Marshall is much, much better at this. And one of the things I talk about in the book is even in 1952 and 1953, when Brown versus Board of Education is being argued, Marshall is signaling to the U.S. Supreme Court justices about integration. He goes to lunch with John W. Davis, his opposing lawyer, who's is the most prestigious lawyer in the country, and who's a South Carolinian, and who's a white supremacist, and who will never go to lunch with any black person. except if it's Thurgood Marshall, right? So he does all these things. He goes to lunch with Davis. These two guys are kind of, one-upping each other in the back of the courtroom when Brown is being argued. And what's that about? Because a lot of people in the NAACP were angry. You're going to lunch with John W. Davis, a defender of white supremacy? But Marshall knew what he was doing. He was signaling to the world around him and to the Supreme Court justices who were going to decide the case that blacks and whites can interact, right? Integration can happen. Here, me and John W. Davis, a white supremacist, are joking in the back of the courtroom. This is what is possible. And Marshall's very, very smart. He's quite good at kind of understanding contexts and pushing them and working within them. And he's a little bit easier for mainstream America to take than Pauli Murray or Loren Miller. Well, integrationism, one thing I do try to, this is actually a book about integrationism. It is a book about what did these lawyers believe and do and how did they act, really just in a place where acting the wrong way could get you lynched. That's kind of how it is sometimes. And integration is a really complicated and messy project, and Marshall knew it. He always knew that he was a black middle-class person and he was a lawyer, and he was more acceptable to white people than other black people were. But he also always knew that neither blacks nor whites wanted him to be white. The integrationism was always sort of stereotyped. They didn't want him to be white, they wanted him to be authentically black, right? And these two things are really in deep conflict with one another. And we still live with that conflict in our own society. We often demand of prominent black people that they both be acceptable to whites and authentically black. And Marshall understood that. He lived his life with this tension, from the time he became a lawyer to the time he went on to the Supreme Court. And I think he understood. He understood that integration was messy, it was complicated, it was contradictory, it was going to be painful. I think maybe what he didn't understand was the kind of deep resistance, the level of resistance to it. But Marshall and his colleagues are sometimes stereotyped as these sort of naive integrationists. And I would hope that, the story that I'm telling in the book would make that conclusion a harder one to reach. Yeah, I think there are many frontiers. Our society is changing. We have a federal judiciary, at least, which is more and more hostile to the idea of social change through law every year. We have a Supreme Court, which is more and more hostile to the idea of liberal social change through law every year, and more welcoming of conservative social change through law every year. And in fact, is probably the most activist Supreme Court in a couple of decades, as we'll find out at the end of this term. So, there are certainly limits to law, but law means a lot of things, and Marshall would have been the first person to say this. Law means litigation. Law means lobbying for legislation. Law means arguing about law, right? So there's a bunch of things that are going on right now, many legal frontiers. There's an argument that's going on about the death penalty right now. We basically thought that one was over about 15 years ago, but it's open. And it's open for just a different set of reasons than we argued about 15 years ago. It's open because people start to look at the application of the death penalty and understand that it's basically impossible. We live in a very racist and prejudiced and unfair society. And in the application of that ultimate penalty, many of our own failings as a society will become evident, right? And that's one frontier. Second frontier, I've talked about this in an interview I did recently, felon disfranchisement. The number of people who go to prison, the proportion of those people who are African American or Latino, and what happens to them when they come out. They can't vote for the rest of their lives in many, many states. They can't get a job Because, well, you know, on an employment application, one of the things that is asked is, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And, you know, you've got 200 applications for a job. You got to figure out who you're going to interview. The felons are going to go in the non-interview pile. And, you know, the NAACP, it often gets stereotyped, but they had a bunch of activism about this about a year and a half ago, and they came to agreement with a bunch of large corporations that they would take that question off. So there are many, many ways to promote and advance legal strategies in a world in which many of the problems don't seem resolvable by courts. But to do law, to argue about law, to be a legal advocate means a lot of different things. And I think that's something that the lawyers that I'm writing about in the book understood completely. And I had mentioned Brian Stevenson. There are a bunch of people who are in the trenches in places where, let's say, the odds seem to be stacked against you. And they still fight the fight. And there are many fights to be fought, as I said before. I mean, the Trayvon murder, Trayvon Martin shooting happened one county over from where in 1950, Thurgood Marshall goes to the county and is not sure if he's going to be lynched. You know, his colleagues in the NAACP's national office say, don't go there, right? And that's well within the lifetime of many, many people. There's still work to be done on many fronts, and there are many people who are doing that work. The surprising things I learned is just how complicated the worlds of these people really were. They are heroes in many ways, right? These are people who did things, who had the courage to do things that, you know, I don't know if I'd have the courage to go into a courtroom where I'm not sure if I'm going to be lynched. But they did things like that. But their worlds turned out to be so complicated. Like just the things that I found about Thurgood Marshall, that, you know, Thurgood Marshall became the person in Maryland that, you know, if Thurgood Marshall said a trial was unfair, white lawyers and judges knew that they had a problem. On the other hand, if he said that it was fair, that was kind of the end of the line. So there's one trial, for instance, I read these things. There was one man who, his trial took 12 minutes, black man. He was convicted of murder in 12 minutes. Excuse me, I'm sorry, he was convicted of rape in 12 minutes. And Thurgood Marshall came out, he said the trial was fair. And that was it, right? So that Marshall had that kind of power. But he also had that kind of power where the following year there was a white police officer who had shot and killed a black motorist. And they tried to try him criminally. They couldn't get a conviction. And then Marshall brought a civil suit. And they got a $12,000 verdict from a white jury in rural Maryland. And in a very racist part of rural Maryland, Thurgood Marshall gets a $12,000 verdict. And $12,000 is a lot of money in 1935. How does he do that? Because, again, you know, Marshall said something was wrong. He became the person who white people actually really believed. Right? So there were stories like that which they don't fit in the stories that we read about Thurgood Marshall. They're not quite heroic stories. They're actually not, neither are they stories of Marshall as the kind of naive integrationist. They're the stories of the messiness of racial politics, even in the era of segregation. Those kinds of things really surprised me. Pauli Murray's sexual orientation just floored me. I'll show you some pictures. Maybe some of you, actually I tried to make the pictures in the book basically tell a very interesting story just by themselves. But here are two pictures of Pauli Murray. This is in the center of the book. There's a picture up here. This is from 1927. She's graduating from high school, and basically this looks like a 1920s woman, right? She's got short hair. She's got the band. She's got the flapper type dress. She looks like a version of conventional femininity. And the picture down here, she's much thinner. She has short hair, and there's something odd looking about her. And, you know, I've been looking at these pictures probably since about 1994. And I always thought that there was something odd about her. And you wonder about her sexual orientation, but you just can't find these things out. Well, it turns out that Pauli Murray was a very good diary keeper. She was very honest in her diary about things that she was not honest about in her other writings. She was honest about everything, just about everything but her sexual orientation. And her diary is in one box over in the Schlesinger Library. And if you open that box, you see it all. And if you don't open that box, you open 250 other boxes, you don't see it. So I opened that box, and I saw it. Oh, I saw her diary. I'm sorry. I saw her diary and her medical records. And you see it. And then I began to see all this other stuff, you know, kind of why and how she came up with the idea that sex discrimination was like race discrimination. And it's all in this complicated story that works its way out in her diary and her medical records, which are just in this place. And if you don't find that place, you know, you look at these two pictures and you wonder and wonder and wonder, and you write about Pauli Murray, but you don't really see the thing that really explains it all. And I just happened to find the thing that really explains it all. So sometimes, her diaries and her medical records.
What's in it?
Well, we will be selling copies at the end of. No, actually, what's in it? It's her diary. She's very honest in her diary. So she will say, you know, that she took a trip and. Well, actually, she's not always honest in her diaries, but she's honest enough. You can sort of see it. I mean, she took a trip. The love of her life was a woman named Peg Holmes. She lived here in Boston. She was a daughter of a very prominent white family here. The love of her life was Peg Holmes, and they fell in love in the 1930s. And Peg Holmes subsequently went off and got married to a man and lived that way for the rest of her life. And she would write about her and Holmes in the diary and about their relationship. She was honest in her letters to her mother. Her foster mother is actually her aunt, and her mother is in North Carolina. And her mother is this black woman born, you know, in the 19th century, not in the 20th century, black woman born in the 19th century in North Carolina, but her foster mother accepted it. So she was honest in her letters to her foster mother about what was really going on. She underwent medical treatments for years. She went to see sex doctors. She thought that she was a man in a woman's body. She wanted to try to prove it. So the correspondence with her medical doctors are in her papers. And she would write notes, you know, okay, I'm in the hospital. I've just had a terrible breakdown because, like, I can't figure out what I am. I'm in the hospital, and these are my notes about what's going on with me. This is what the doctor's saying. You know, there are places where she is pretty honest about this stuff, and you start to read it, and you're like, okay, this is what it is. Well, I mean, the question I originally thought, oh, is Pauli Murray a lesbian? Turns out that Pauli Murray is not a lesbian. She very adamantly says, I am not a lesbian. I am a man in a woman's body, which is a different thing. So because she thought she was a man in a woman's body, she thought that she should do all the things that men do, right? So it's different than thinking she was a lesbian. That would be a different set of identifications. So because she thought she was a man in a woman's body, things that other women lawyers sort of halfway accepted, thought maybe something was wrong with this. No, to Pauli Murray, it was clear. This is discrimination, just like race discrimination is discrimination. And it should be actionable under the 14th Amendment. These are radical views, and it all came out of this weird identity that she has. I mean, she rejects, the term in her time was homosexual. She rejects the term homosexual. She said, that's not me. Like, I know all these homosexuals. They're not me. I am a man in a woman's body. And that's what she believes. So these are the kinds of things you find in her medical records, and she's very honest. Even though, you know, you can read everything. She has an autobiography. I read her autobiography. You can't figure it out, can't figure it out, can't figure it out. And if you figure out, what you think you're going to find is that she's a lesbian. But then when you go and you look in her papers, what you find is no. It's far more complicated than that. And because it's far more complicated than that, Pauli Murray is able to see things that other people in her time couldn't see. Thank you all for coming.